I'm not sure if I've covered it yet, and I'm just going off script here, but just to give, because I'm not sure if I covered it, and I don't think I have in this, my personal story. But the only acharya that we're aware of in our disciplic line who had multiple ashrams, multiple centers, and after he left, and he set up multiple gurus to function in those centers, was Madhva Acharya. I think he had 8 or 10, I can't remember, 8 or 10 ashrams or maths. And while he was living, one sannyasi was in charge of each separate math. So there were 8 or 10 maths, there were 8 or 10 sannyasis, his disciples, who were managing and running those separate maths. Before he departed, he had then authorized the sannyasi in each of those centers to then become the next acharya. They would become the next acharya for that ashram. So basically what he did was he divided his centers up before he left and said, now this sannyasi of that center, he will become the next acharya, and he will be the spiritual master for that center. And then the other center will have its own separate acharya for that center. And he wrote down, this was what, 700 years ago? He wrote down how the disciplic succession was to transfer to the next guru. He wrote it down, a guideline for them to follow. And each and every center of Madhva Acharya's 8 or 10 maths are still following that system that Madhva Acharya had written down. They're still following it to this day. And there are 8 separate gurus and 8 separate disciplic lines that came from Madhva Acharya, and that they're still following that line to this day in those maths. Of course, other gurus have, within disciples, and have branched out, and part of that branch came down to Madhavendra Puri and Ishvar Puri and Lord Chaitanya. But the maths themselves, the 8 or 10 maths, are still following those guidelines. And that's about the closest we have. But you see, that is not the system that Srila Prabhupada set up. Srila Prabhupada did not appoint a separate sannyasi to be in charge of all his 108 centers when he left. He had a GBC system, and he said that GBC body will become the ultimate authority for the centers. And each one, the world is divided up by zones, so each GBC has their own zone, and within that zone is so many temples. So they oversee those temples, they oversee the spiritual Krishna consciousness of those centers. They look after the spirit, they make sure that the centers are following the standards, spiritual standards that Srila Prabhupada set. So anyway, this is all explained. But that's the system that Srila Prabhupada set up. It is totally different than the system that Madhva Acharya set up. So there is no past precedence to go by to see how was this done by a previous Acharya, where there were so many separate ashrams, so many separate, within one mission. And when the Acharya left, and that there's supposed to be multiple gurus within that system, there is nothing for them to look back on to see how it was done by a previous Acharya, because it was never done that way by a previous Acharya. Each ashram had its own guru, because that is the way, then there's no conflict. So, but within ISKCON, we have the GBC, and when you try to have multiple gurus, well, they're not the guru of their own ashram, so they are not the master. And that means they can't give the actual final instructions to their disciples, and what's the use of having such useless gurus? They're show bottle gurus only. As Prabhupada said, they're a fashion guru. So to do that only causes conflicts with the authority by having multiple gurus within the same one ashram and a GBC authority. It creates conflict of authority, and the prescribed duties that Srila Prabhupada had given to the GBC are now being usurped and taken over only for those who they give the initiation ceremony by the gurus, and the GBC is no longer performing their prescribed duties and functions. So the whole system becomes broken down, and the gurus are just empty show bottle gurus, as I was saying, because they're restricted and they cannot act as actual real spiritual masters of their disciples and give their give their disciples ultimate orders and instructions and guidance, because that would conflict with the ultimate authority of the GBC. So they're not the real ashram master. The GBC is. So today the whole system in ISKCON is actually backwards and upside down.